The hospital had always been a place of dread for Michelle, not just because of the sickness and death that lingered in the air, but because of the stories, the whispers of things unseen that prowled the sterile halls at night. When she took the night shift job at St. Vincent's, the struggling, nearly defunct hospital on the edge of town, she told herself the stories were just urban legends. But deep down, she wasn't sure she believed that. Her first few nights passed uneventfully. The emptiness of the hospital was unnerving. The way the fluorescent lights buzzed against the silence, the way shadows seemed to stretch too far down the hallways. There were only a handful of patients on the floors, mostly elderly, their rooms dimly lit and eerily quiet. On her fourth night, things began to shift. It started with the elevator. No one had called it, but as Michelle stood at the nurse's station charting a patient's vitals, she heard the soft chime and the faint whoosh of the doors opening. She glanced up, expecting to see one of the few doctors or orderlies stepping out, but the elevator was empty. She stared at it for a moment, a cold prickle running down her spine, before stepping over and pressing the button to send it back down to the ground floor. The doors slid shut, and she watched the numbers above tick down. Then the phone at the nurse's station rang. She jumped, startled by the sharp sound in the quiet. When she picked it up, there was only static on the other end. "Hello?" she asked, her voice catching slightly. The static hissed for a moment longer before the line went dead. Michelle shook her head and told herself to get a grip. Old building, faulty wiring, it was nothing more than that. But as the night wore on, the sense of unease only deepened. Around 3 a.m, she was making her rounds when she heard the first sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of fabric. She paused outside one of the patient rooms, straining to hear it again. And then it came, a soft, breathy whisper. It wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding, but the hallway was empty. The fluorescent lights cast harsh, unbroken light down the sterile corridor, and there was nowhere for anyone to hide. For a long moment, she just stood there, her breath shallow and quick before forcing herself to move. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was just tired, that the late hour and the isolation were playing tricks on her. But the whispers didn't stop. Over the next hour, they followed her as she moved through the halls, always just behind her, just out of reach. Sometimes it was a single word, unintelligible and faint. Other times it was a low murmur, like a conversation happening in the next room over. But when she checked, the rooms were empty. Then came the shadows. She saw the first one as she turned a corner. It flickered at the edge of her vision, too quick to catch, slipping into a patient's room. She froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. Slowly, she stepped toward the room, her hand gripping the edge of the doorway as she leaned in. The room was dark, the patient inside fast asleep, the heart monitor beeping steadily. Nothing moved. As the hours crept toward dawn, the occurrences escalated. Lights flickered and went out, plunging entire hallways into darkness. Doors that she had closed swung open on their own, and the static on the hospital intercom system crackled with faint voices, muffled, urgent, and angry. She tried to call for help, but her phone had no signal, and the hospital's landlines emitted only that same static. By 5 a.m, Michelle was gripping the nurse's station counter so tightly her knuckles were white. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was tired, that she was losing it. But then she saw the figure. It was standing at the end of the hallway, a silhouette against the flickering light. Tall, gaunt, and impossibly still, it didn't move as she stared at it. Her breath caught in her throat and she felt frozen, unable to look away. Then it began to walk toward her. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and wrong, as if its joints didn't quite work the way they should. As it came closer, she could make out more details. Its face was obscured, blurred, like an image out of focus, and its hands were long and skeletal. Michelle backed away, her legs trembling, but the figure kept coming. She stumbled into an empty patient room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the lock. The whispers outside grew louder, more insistent, and then they turned to banging. The door rattled on its hinges as if something on the other side was trying to force its way in. Michelle pressed herself against the far wall, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself. "This isn't real." But the banging stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. She waited, her heart hammering in her chest, straining to hear anything on the other side of the door. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The door creaked open, inch by inch, revealing nothing but the empty hallway beyond. She stepped forward, her legs unsteady, and peered out. The figure was gone. The shadows were gone. Even the whispers had stopped. The rest of the shift passed in a haze. When the morning staff arrived, Michelle handed in her resignation on the spot. She didn't stay to explain. She didn't even look back. Years later, she heard that St. Vincent's had finally closed down, the building abandoned. People said it was because of funding issues, but Michelle knew the truth. Some places are just wrong, their walls soaked in suffering, their halls echoing with things that were never meant to be seen or heard. And some of those things never leave. The hospital was a sprawling labyrinth of shadowed corridors and forgotten rooms, its history marred by rumors of malpractice, sudden deaths, and unexplained disappearances. It was the kind of place that locals whispered about but rarely entered, except in dire emergencies. For Jason, though, it was just another paycheck. A night shift security guard at the defunct Wing C of St. Mercy Hospital, a wing so neglected it barely seemed part of the same building. The night began quietly, as it always did. Jason made his rounds, his flashlight cutting through the darkness of the hallways. The air was stale, and the faint hum of old electrical systems seemed to pulse through the walls. The patients from years ago were long gone, transferred or deceased, leaving the wing abandoned. Yet, every now and then, Jason swore he felt like someone or something was watching him. It was near 1:30 a.m. when the first oddity occurred. Jason was seated at the security desk, flipping through an old paperback novel when the elevator at the far end of the hallway chimed. His head snapped up. No one was supposed to be in this part of the hospital, and the elevator hadn't worked in years. He grabbed his flashlight and made his way down the hall. As he approached, he could hear the soft grind of gears and the hiss of the doors sliding open. The elevator's interior was pitch black, its emergency light long burned out. Jason leaned in cautiously, his flashlight sweeping across the empty cabin. The panel inside was cracked and lifeless, the buttons caked in dust. "Anyone there?" he called, his voice echoing. There was no answer, only silence. He stepped back, shook his head, and pressed the button to send the elevator down. The doors closed with a metallic groan, and Jason turned to leave. But then he heard it, a whisper, faint and breathy, drifting from within the elevator. It wasn't a single voice. It was many, overlapping, indistinct. Jason froze, his blood turning to ice. Slowly, he turned back. The doors slid open again, and this time, the cabin wasn't empty. A shadow stood in the center, tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. The flashlight beam flickered as Jason tried to steady his hand, illuminating nothing but the faint outline of the figure. And then, with a sickening, bone-cracking movement, the shadow stepped forward. Jason stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The figure dissolved into the darkness just as suddenly as it had appeared. Jason's rational mind screamed at him to leave, but protocol, and a strange, morbid curiosity, kept him rooted to the spot. He peered inside the elevator again, but it was empty. For the next hour, Jason tried to focus on his rounds, telling himself it had been a trick of the light, a momentary lapse in sanity brought on by boredom and lack of sleep. But the hospital seemed different now, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were watching him. At 3 a.m., the lights began to flicker. Not just in one hallway, but throughout the entire wing. Jason's radio crackled with static, and then a faint voice, barely audible, whispered his name. Jason. He froze, clutching the radio. Who's there? This isn't funny. The static persisted, and then the voice came again, clearer this time, and undeniably female. Jason, come to room 317. He swallowed hard. Room 317 was on the third floor, a part of the hospital that had been sealed off for decades. Rumor had it that the room had been the site of a violent incident. A nurse had gone missing, her body never found. Staff claimed to hear her cries echoing through the walls late at night. Jason wanted to ignore it, to leave right then and there, but his feet carried him to the stairwell. His flashlight flickered again as he ascended, the air growing colder with each step. By the time he reached the third floor, his breath was visible, and the silence was oppressive. The door to room 317 was slightly ajar, the number hanging crookedly. Jason hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But something compelled him to push the door open. Inside, the room was empty save for a rusted bed frame and peeling wallpaper. The window at the far end was covered in grime, casting an eerie glow across the floor. Jason stepped inside, his footsteps echoing. Then the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. The whispers were back, louder now and coming from all directions. He pressed himself against the wall, his chest heaving. Shadows began to writhe along the edges of the room, twisting and shifting like living things. A figure emerged from the corner, a woman, her face obscured by a curtain of matted hair. She wore a nurse's uniform stained with something dark and wet. Jason tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman's head snapped upward, revealing hollow, empty eye sockets. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, and she lunged. Jason bolted for the door, slamming his body into it until it gave way. He stumbled into the hallway and sprinted down the stairs, not stopping until he reached the ground floor. He burst out of the hospital and into the cold night air, collapsing onto the pavement. He never went back. Months later, when the hospital was finally demolished, construction crews reported strange occurrences. Tools went missing, voices echoed through the empty halls, and one worker swore he saw a woman in a blood-stained uniform watching from a window on the 3rd floor. No one dared investigate. The cold, sterile air of Briarwood General Hospital seemed thicker at night, as though the building itself breathed a heavy sigh of despair. Emma had taken the night shift in the oncology ward for the extra pay, but she quickly realized why so many avoided it. Patients rarely stayed awake, the silence was overwhelming, and the shadows stretched unnaturally long under the flickering fluorescent lights. She told herself the strange things she noticed were just her imagination. It started small. Footsteps down the hall when she was alone, the distant hum of voices in empty rooms. She'd glance at the security monitors, only to see static or an empty corridor where movement had just caught her eye. But one night, something happened that she couldn't explain away. It was 2:14 a.m. when Emma heard the sound of a child laughing. It was faint but unmistakable, echoing from the far end of the hall. She froze mid-charting. The oncology ward didn't treat children, it was strictly for adults. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but the laugh came again. Higher, pitched this time, like the sound of a child playing a game. "Hello?" she called, stepping cautiously out of the nurse's station. Her voice carried down the long, dimly lit hallway, but there was no response. Her heart pounded as she followed the sound, her footsteps echoing unnaturally. The laugh seemed to dance ahead of her, always just out of reach, drawing her deeper into the hospital's labyrinthine halls. She stopped outside room 409. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled from within. She didn't recall anyone being in that room. It had been cleared for renovation weeks ago. Swallowing hard, Emma pushed the door open. The room was empty, just a barren bed frame and an old IV stand silhouetted against the window. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something chilling. Small handprints were smeared across the dusty glass, as though a child had pressed their hands there from the inside. Emma's stomach twisted. She left the room quickly, her breath shallow, and hurried back to the nurse's station. She resolved to ignore the sound if it came again, chalking it up to stress, lack of sleep, or her mind playing tricks. But the night had other plans. At 3:33 a.m., the call light for room 409 began to flash. Emma stared at the monitor, her hands trembling. No one was in that room, and no one had been for weeks. Slowly, she grabbed her flashlight and walked back toward the room, the hall eerily silent. The door was wide open now. The bed, which had been empty earlier, was covered in a pristine white sheet. A shape lay beneath it, small and still, as if a child were sleeping there. Emma's blood ran cold. "Is someone there?" she whispered, barely able to speak. The sheet moved. Just a slight twitch, but it was enough. She stepped back, her flashlight shaking as she shone it at the bed. The shape sat up suddenly, the sheet slipping away to reveal a child, no older than 6. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken but staring straight into hers. "You shouldn't be here," the boy said, his voice soft but hollow, as though it echoed from somewhere deep within the walls. Emma stumbled backward, nearly dropping her flashlight. The boy tilted his head, his expression vacant, and then he smiled, a grin so wide it seemed to split his face unnaturally. Before Emma could react, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out completely. She was plunged into darkness, the beam of her flashlight the only source of light. The sound of laughter filled the air again, but this time it was layered, multiplied, a cacophony of children laughing and whispering, growing louder and louder. Emma turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest. The whispers followed her, echoing her name, the laughter turning to shrill screams. She didn't stop until she reached the elevator, frantically mashing the button. The doors slid open, and she darted inside, slamming her hand on the button for the lobby. The elevator jolted to life, but as it descended, the lights inside flickered, and the laughter returned. Emma pressed herself into the corner, her flashlight beam shaking as she pointed it at the elevator doors. They opened with a chime. But instead of the lobby, she was greeted by darkness. The smell of antiseptic and decay wafted in, and a soft, rhythmic tapping echoed from the shadows ahead. Emma stepped forward, the flashlight revealing a hallway she didn't recognize. The walls were damp and stained, the floor covered in discarded hospital gowns. At the end of the hall stood the boy, his back to her. "Leave," he said, his voice low and guttural now. I don't know how," Emma stammered, tears streaming down her face. The boy turned slowly, his eyes now black pits, his grin impossibly wide. Behind him, figures began to emerge from the shadows. Dozens of children, their faces pale and lifeless, their mouths moving in unison as they whispered something Emma couldn't understand. Her flashlight flickered once and went out. When the morning staff arrived, they found Emma in the elevator, unconscious and muttering incoherently. She was taken to the ER, but she never spoke about what happened that night. She left the job the next day and moved out of town shortly after. Briarwood General shut down a few months later. They said it was due to funding issues, but the staff knew better. None of them could explain the laughter they sometimes heard in the halls, or the small handprints that appeared on the windows of the abandoned rooms. The storm had rolled in suddenly, black clouds swallowing the moonlight and casting the old hospital in oppressive darkness. Ashton had been reassigned to the night shift for the week, covering the graveyard hours in the deserted psychiatric wing. He tried to convince himself it was just another shift, but the stories he'd heard about this part of the hospital clung to him like a second skin. The patients who had once filled these rooms were long gone, but the memories of what happened there, lobotomies, unexplained deaths, cruel experiments, were said to linger. The power flickered as he made his first round, his flashlight cutting through the dense shadows. The psychiatric wing had been closed for years, yet his orders were to ensure no trespassers or squatters had made it their home. The hallways were unnaturally cold, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic like blood left to dry for decades. Ashton's boots echoed on the tiled floor, each step louder than the last. The first few rooms were uneventful, their doors ajar to reveal rusted bed frames and peeling wallpaper. But as he approached room 216, he felt a change in the air. Thicker, heavier, as though the building itself held its breath. The door was closed. His flashlight beam danced across the brass numbers, tarnished with age. Ashton hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to move on. But protocol was protocol. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, or so it seemed. A metal chair sat in the center, bolted to the floor. Restraints dangled from its arms, swaying slightly, though there was no draft. The walls were lined with deep gouges, as though someone had clawed at them in desperation. But what caught Ashton's attention was the smell, stronger here, the metallic tang almost overpowering. He stepped closer, shining his light toward the chair. A single word was scratched into the floor beneath it. "Stay!" A chill ran down his spine. He backed out of the room quickly, shutting the door behind him. He told himself it was just graffiti, probably left by some bored kids who had snuck in years ago. But deep down, he knew better. As he continued down the hall, he heard it. A faint tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind him. He turned, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The tapping stopped. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. Silence answered him. He turned back around and froze. The door to room 216 was wide open again. His flashlight began to flicker. He smacked it against his palm, trying to steady the beam. When the light returned, his heart nearly stopped. A figure stood just inside the doorway, hunched and unmoving. It was pale, its skin almost translucent, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Ashton took a step back, his mind racing. "Who are you? You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned its head slowly to face him, its eyes black voids that seemed to pull in the dim light around it. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged yellow teeth, and then it moved. Not walking, but gliding, closing the distance between them in an instant. Ashton stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam illuminated the creature for just a moment, its limbs impossibly long, its body contorted in ways that defied logic. He ran. The hallways seemed endless, twisting and stretching into unfamiliar shapes. Doors he had passed earlier were now gone, replaced by blank walls. The tapping started again, louder now, accompanied by whispers that seemed to come from inside his own head. "They never leave." The voice was soft but insistent, repeating the phrase over and over. He turned a corner and found himself in front of an old metal door, its surface dented and rusted. A sign above it read, "Morgue." The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices urging him forward. He didn't want to go in, but his body betrayed him, his hand reaching for the handle, as if controlled by something else. The door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an eerie green light. Steel drawers lined the walls, some slightly ajar. The air was freezing, each breath forming a cloud of mist in front of his face. In the center of the room stood a single gurney. On it lay a body covered with a white sheet. The sheet rose and fell slightly, as though the body beneath it was breathing. Ashton's feet moved on their own, carrying him closer to the gurney. His hand reached out, trembling, and grasped the edge of the sheet. The whispers stopped. He yanked the sheet away. The gurney was empty. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the room, and the drawers began to slam open and shut violently. Ashton backed away, his heart pounding, but the door he had entered through was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the paint bubbling and peeling as though it were alive. The laughter grew louder, deafening, and the room began to spin. Shadows spilled from the corners, forming into shapes, figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths that reached for him. The last thing Ashton saw before everything went black was the gurney, now occupied by his own lifeless body, his face frozen in a mask of terror. When the morning shift arrived, they found the psychiatric wing empty. Ashton was gone, his radio and flashlight abandoned in the hall outside room 16. Security footage showed him walking into the morgue, but he never came out. To this day, staff claim to hear tapping in the halls at night, followed by faint whispers, and every so often, a new word appears scratched into the floor of room 216. Run. The night shift at Blackridge County Hospital was always eerily quiet. Located miles from the nearest town, the hospital's isolation only amplified its unsettling atmosphere. For Karen, a new nurse on her first overnight shift, the emptiness was almost unbearable. The dimly lit hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering fluorescent lights casting unsettling shadows on the peeling walls. She'd been assigned to the third floor, an unused wing that was said to be under renovation. Karen wasn't thrilled about patrolling an abandoned floor, but she figured it was an easy way to avoid the chaos of the ER. The elevator groaned as it stopped at the third floor. The doors slid open, revealing a long, silent corridor. Dust motes floated in the air, and the smell of mildew hung heavy. Karen stepped out hesitantly, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. As she walked down the hall, the sound of her footsteps echoed unnervingly. Most of the rooms were empty, their doors wide open to reveal broken beds and discarded equipment. But one door at the far end of the hall was closed. Room 307. Karen's stomach knotted as she approached it. The handle was old and rusted, and when she touched it, it felt unnaturally cold, as though the metal had been left outside on a winter night. She hesitated, but eventually turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a perfectly preserved hospital room. Unlike the rest of the wing, this room looked as if it had been frozen in time. The bed was neatly made, the medical equipment polished and clean. On the bedside table sat a small vase with fresh flowers, their petals a vibrant red. Karen's brow furrowed. "What the?" she whispered. A faint beeping sound drew her attention to the monitor beside the bed. Its screen was blank, yet it emitted the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. Karen backed away, her unease growing. That's when she noticed something even more unsettling. A faint outline on the bed, as if someone were lying beneath the sheets. Her flashlight flickered. The beam dimmed for a moment, and when it returned, the bed was empty. But the sound of the heartbeat persisted, growing louder. Karen's pulse quickened as she stepped out of the room, pulling the door shut behind her. The hallway had changed. The walls were no longer cracked and peeling, but pristine, freshly painted in a sterile white. The lights above buzzed softly, their flickering now steady. Karen turned and her breath caught in her throat. The corridor was filled with people. Patients in hospital gowns shuffled aimlessly, their heads bowed, their faces obscured. Nurses and doctors moved among them, but their movements were stiff and robotic, like marionettes on strings. None of them acknowledged her. "Hello?" Karen called out, her voice trembling. A nurse turned her head slowly to face her. The woman's face was pale, her eyes sunken and hollow. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but instead of words, a raspy, choking noise came out. Karen stumbled back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. She turned to run, but found herself facing room 307 again. The door was open, and the light inside spilled into the hallway like a beacon. Against her better judgment, Karen felt drawn to it, her legs carrying her forward despite her fear. Inside, the bed was no longer empty. A man lay there, his face gaunt and his skin deathly pale. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, though his eyes were wide open and unblinking. Karen froze, unable to look away as the man's head slowly turned to face her. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Karen stepped closer, her instinct to help overriding her terror. "What happened to you?" she asked. "They won't let me leave," the man said, his voice shaking. His hand reached out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "You have to go, before they take you too." The room grew colder, the air so icy it burned her lungs. The man's grip tightened, and Karen saw something behind him, shadows writhing along the walls, twisting into humanoid shapes. Their glowing eyes fixed on her, and their mouths opened wide, emitting a deafening, inhuman scream. Karen tore free from the man's grasp and bolted out of the room. The hallway was empty again, but the whispers began, soft at first, then louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." She sprinted to the elevator, slamming her hand against the button. The doors opened, and she threw herself inside, jabbing the button for the lobby repeatedly. The doors closed just as the shadows reached her, their tendrils clawing at the edges. The ride down was agonizingly slow. The elevator lights flickered and the whispers seeped into the small space. Karen pressed herself into the corner, her heart racing. When the doors finally opened, she was greeted by the bright, bustling chaos of the ER. The sound of patients and staff was a jarring contrast to the silence she'd just escaped. Karen stumbled out, her legs weak, and collapsed into a chair in the waiting area. A doctor approached her, concern etched on his face. "Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. Karen tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She pointed weakly toward the elevator. The doctor frowned. "The third floor? That wing's been sealed off for decades. It's not safe up there. No one should be using it." Karen's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? I was just there." The doctor shook his head. "That floor's been abandoned since the fire in '78. Half the wing was destroyed, and several patients and staff didn't make it out. Some say their spirits are still up there, but that's just old superstition." Karen left her shift that night and never returned. But sometimes, late at night, she'd wake up to the faint sound of a heartbeat monitor, steady and rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was reminding her of the place she'd barely escaped. The power went out just as Lily began her night shift at Pine Hollow General, a small hospital nestled in the woods on the outskirts of town. The backup generators kicked in, bathing the halls in a dim, orange glow. She hated working nights, especially during storms. The rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through cracks in the old building, making it sound alive. Lily was covering the ICU that evening, and with only 2 patients under her care, it should have been an easy shift. But something about the night felt off. Her first patient, Mr. Bell, was stable but unconscious after a heart attack. The second, an elderly woman named Mrs. Grant, was known for her bouts of confusion and restlessness. Lily had been warned about her. "She talks about seeing things," the day nurse had said, her tone dismissive. At 11:47 p.m., Lily sat at her station reviewing charts when a flicker of movement caught her eye. She looked up just in time to see a shadow dart across the end of the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat. Probably just another nurse, she muttered to herself. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. At midnight, the monitors in Mr. Bell's room began to beep erratically. Lily rushed in, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. His heart rate was spiking, but when she checked his vitals, everything seemed fine. Confused, she reset the monitor and stepped back. That's when she saw it. In the reflection of the dark window, a figure stood in the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly thin, and its face was obscured by shadow. Lily spun around, but the corner was empty. Her breath came in short gasps as she backed out of the room, her hand gripping the doorframe. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the light, but the hairs on the back of her neck wouldn't settle. Mrs. Grant's voice broke the silence. "She's here," the old woman whispered. Lily turned to see Mrs. Grant standing in the doorway of her room, her frail hands clutching the frame for support. "Mrs. Grant, you shouldn't be out of bed," Lily said, rushing to her side, but the old woman shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "She doesn't like it when we talk about her," she muttered. "You've seen her now. She knows." "Who knows?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. "The woman in black," Mrs. Grant replied, her voice barely audible. "She watches. She waits." Lily guided Mrs. Grant back to bed, but the woman wouldn't stop talking. "She's been here for years," she said. "Long before you or I. She doesn't like us meddling. She takes what she wants." By 2 a.m., Lily was on edge. The ICU was too quiet. Even the hum of the backup generator seemed muffled. She decided to check on Mr. Bell again, though her stomach churned at the thought of going back into his room. The bed was empty. Her heart dropped. The wires from the monitor dangled uselessly, and the IV bag swung slightly as if it had just been moved. "Mr. Bell?" she called, her voice cracking. A low, guttural moan echoed from the hallway. She turned and saw him, standing at the end of the corridor. His hospital gown hung loosely on his withered frame, and his head lolled unnaturally to one side. "Mr. Bell," she called again, taking a hesitant step forward. He turned slowly, and that's when she saw his face. His eyes were completely black, and his mouth was stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. "Leave," he said, though his lips didn't move. The voice was deep, distorted, and it reverberated through the empty halls. Lily stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned to run, but found herself face to face with Mrs. Grant, who had somehow appeared behind her. "You can't run from her," Mrs. Grant whispered, her voice hollow. The lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness. When they came back on, Mr. Bell was gone. Mrs. Grant collapsed to the floor, her body limp and lifeless. Panicked, Lily grabbed her radio and called for help, but all she got was static. The monitors in both rooms began to beep in unison, their alarms blaring as though warning her to leave. She ran to the nearest exit, her breathing ragged, but the door wouldn't budge. The handle was ice cold, and no matter how hard she pushed or pulled, it stayed locked. A low laugh echoed behind her, sending a shiver down her spine. She turned slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The woman in black stood at the end of the hall. Her figure was shrouded in shadows, but Lily could see her face now, pale, hollow, and inhuman. Her eyes were empty voids, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that seemed to grow wider the longer Lily stared. The woman raised a bony hand and pointed directly at her. Lily screamed and bolted down the hallway, desperate to find another way out. She burst into the stairwell and began descending as fast as her legs would carry her. But no matter how far she ran, the stairs seemed to stretch on forever, spiraling downward into endless darkness. The last thing Lily heard before her flashlight died was the woman's voice, cold and sharp, whispering in her ear, "You're mine now." Lily never made it out of Pine Hollow General. When the day shift arrived, they found the ICU abandoned. The records showed that Mr. Bell and Mrs. Grant had passed away during the night, though the details were unclear. As for Lily, she was never found. But staff often report hearing footsteps echoing through the ICU at night, followed by a soft whisper, "She's here." The old St. Vincent Asylum had been shuttered for nearly 30 years, but in the small, crumbling town where it loomed, rumors of its haunted halls never ceased. The stories ranged from eerie sounds to phantom sightings of the patients who had once roamed its halls. So when Carter, a security guard desperate for extra cash, was hired to patrol the building during renovations, he thought it was easy money. The first 2 nights had been uneventful. Dusty corridors, peeling wallpaper, and the occasional creak of the wind through broken windows made the place unsettling, but nothing outright terrifying. By the third night, however, something felt wrong. Carter arrived just before midnight, flashlight in hand, and began his usual patrol. The air inside was colder than it had been the previous nights. His boots echoed through the long, empty hallways, the sound too loud in the oppressive silence. He walked past an old nurse's station, like its counter piled high with forgotten papers and rusting equipment. As he turned a corner, his flashlight flickered. He smacked it against his palm, annoyed, but the beam returned. That's when he noticed the door to room 212 slightly ajar. He distinctly remembered it being shut earlier. "Hello?" he called out, his voice breaking the quiet. It didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be in the building. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Carter approached the door cautiously, his flashlight beam trembling slightly. Pushing it open, he found the room empty except for a single hospital bed, its frame rusted and mattress bare. Just as he was about to leave, a faint sound made him freeze. It was soft at first, like the rustle of fabric, but it grew louder. A wheezing, labored breathing coming from the shadows in the corner. Carter swung his flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Must be the wind," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. As he stepped back into the hallway, a loud metallic clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the building. Carter spun around, his flashlight sweeping the corridor. The sound had come from the East Wing, the area he dreaded most. The East Wing was where the most disturbed patients had been kept. Even in its prime, the staff had whispered about the strange occurrences in that part of the asylum. Now, with its walls crumbling and shadows lurking in every corner, it was downright menacing. Reluctantly, Carter made his way toward the noise. The door to the wing was warped and barely hung on its hinges. As he stepped through, the temperature seemed to drop further. His breath came out in visible puffs. The hallway stretched into darkness, lined with broken doors that led to patient rooms. Faded graffiti marred the walls, symbols and words that made no sense, scrawled in frantic, uneven strokes. At the end of the corridor, he saw a figure. It was hunched over, its back turned to him. The figure swayed slightly, as if struggling to stay upright. "Hey, this is private property!" Carter shouted, though his voice wavered. The figure didn't move. Carter took a cautious step forward, his flashlight illuminating the figure's tattered clothing. It looked like a hospital gown, yellowed with age and streaked with dark stains. "Sir, you need to leave," Carter said, his voice firmer this time. The figure stopped swaying. Slowly, it began to turn. Carter's stomach dropped. The figure's face was gaunt and hollow, its eyes sunken into black pits. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing jagged, broken teeth. The thing let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Carter stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. The figure lunged, moving with an unnatural speed. Carter turned and ran, his boots pounding against the floor as he retraced his steps. The air around him seemed to press in, growing heavier with each step. The hallway stretched impossibly long, and the shadows on the walls twisted and writhed as if alive. He reached the nurse's station, gasping for breath, and glanced back. The figure was gone. But before relief could set in, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. Carter bolted for the main entrance, his heart racing. He didn't stop until he reached the heavy metal doors and shoved them open, spilling out into the cold night air. He didn't return for his final shift. The next day, his supervisor called, annoyed that Carter had abandoned his post. But when Carter explained what had happened, the man grew quiet. "You saw her," he finally said. "Who?" Carter demanded. "Room 212, the supervisor replied. "The last patient in that wing, she was a danger to herself and others. They say she died there, but her spirit never left." Carter hung up, his hands shaking. He never spoke of the incident again, but every now and then, late at night, he'd dream of the asylum. The endless halls, the whispers, and the figure that had turned to reveal its hollow, grinning face. The storm had rolled in fast, bringing with it a heavy fog that blanketed the small town. Sarah had just started her new job as the overnight custodian at Crestwood Medical Center, a building with a dark history. It was said that decades ago, during a fire, several patients had died in the psychiatric wing, and their spirits still lingered. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts, but the rumors gnawed at the back of her mind as she punched in for her first shift. The halls of the hospital were eerily quiet. the kind of silence that felt unnatural. The fluorescent lights above flickered sporadically, and the hum of machinery echoed faintly. Sarah's supervisor had left her a map of the building and a list of rooms to clean, but the psychiatric wing wasn't on it. Must be off limits, she muttered to herself as she pushed her cleaning cart down the corridor. The first few hours passed without incident. She scrubbed floors, emptied trash cans, and mopped up the occasional spilled drink in the waiting area. Around 2 a.m., she decided to take a quick break in the cafeteria. As she walked through the dimly lit halls, she thought she heard a faint noise behind her, a soft shuffling sound. She stopped and turned, but the hallway was empty. Just the building settling, she whispered, trying to convince herself. When she reached the cafeteria, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at one of the metal tables. Her break was uneventful, but as she headed back to her cart, she noticed something strange. The map she'd left on top of the cart was gone. In its place was a crumpled piece of paper. Her stomach tightened as she unfolded it. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Help me, room 308. Sarah's breath hitched. She hadn't been assigned to room 308, and as far as she knew, that part of the hospital was unused. Her first instinct was to report it to security, but something compelled her to check it out herself. Pushing her cart aside, she grabbed her flashlight and made her way to the 3rd floor. The air grew colder as she ascended the stairs, and the smell of mildew became more pronounced. The 3rd floor hallway was darker than the rest of the hospital, the lights dim and buzzing faintly. She found room 308 at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, and the plaque next to it was rusted and barely legible. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing. There was no response. She pushed the door open, her flashlight revealing an abandoned hospital room. The bed was overturned, and the walls were covered in faint scratch marks, as if someone had clawed at them. On the far wall, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "She watches." A sudden noise made Sarah spin around, a faint sobbing coming from the corner of the room. Her flashlight beam trembled as she pointed it toward the sound. A figure crouched in the shadows, its back to her. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The sobbing stopped abruptly. The figure slowly turned its head, revealing a face that didn't seem human. Its skin was pale and stretched tightly over its skull, and its eyes were black voids. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The room plunged into darkness. She scrambled for the flashlight, her hands shaking, and when she finally grabbed it and turned it back on, the figure was gone. The hallway outside the room was different now. The walls seemed to close in, the paint peeling away to reveal old, rotted wood. She tried to run back to the stairs, but the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions. "Please, let me out," she screamed, her voice breaking. Laughter echoed from behind her, soft at first, but growing louder, more guttural. She didn't dare turn around. A door creaked open ahead of her, and she saw faint light spilling out. With no other option, she ran toward it. Inside was a decrepit nurse's station, the desk covered in old charts and dust. On the desk was a folder with her name on it. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper that read, "You've been chosen." Before she could react, the door slammed shut behind her. The laughter grew deafening, and the room filled with an icy wind. The flashlight flickered wildly, and shadows began to emerge from the walls, their shapes twisting and contorting. Sarah screamed as the shadows closed in. When the morning staff arrived, they found her cleaning cart abandoned in the hallway. There was no sign of Sarah, but on the floor where her cart had been was a crumpled piece of paper with the words, "She's one of us now." No one ever took the night custodian job at Crestwood Medical Center again. The Blanchard Memorial Hospital had been shut down for over a decade, its history marred by whispers of malpractice and strange disappearances. Locals avoided it, claiming to hear voices or see figures moving in the shattered windows at night. Despite the rumors, Alex, a struggling photographer looking for urban decay shots, decided to explore the abandoned building. It was supposed to be just another photo shoot, but he would soon realize Blanchard had its own plans for him. He arrived just before sundown, his camera slung around his neck. The hospital loomed before him, its facade cracked and weathered. The broken emergency room sign swung lazily and then creaking with every sway. He squeezed through a gap in the rusted gate and made his way inside. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the metallic tang of rust and decay. Alex clicked on his flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness. He began snapping pictures of the graffiti-stained walls, shattered glass, and rusting gurneys. Every photo seemed to hum with the building's oppressive energy. As he ventured deeper, the temperature dropped, and the silence grew heavier. His footsteps echoed too loudly, as if the building were amplifying the sound. A faint scratching noise made him freeze. He swept his flashlight around, but saw nothing. "Just rats," he muttered, trying to reassure himself. He found himself in what used to be the intensive care unit. The beds were still there, their metal frames warped and mattresses stripped bare. On one bed lay a patient chart, its pages yellowed with age. Alex picked it up and read the name, Patient 372, Status Unresolved. The rest of the details were illegible, the ink smeared as if by water or something else. His unease grew, but he pressed on, determined to finish his shoot. He set up his tripod in what appeared to be the operating theater, its overhead light dangling precariously. As he adjusted his lens, he felt a chill brush against his neck, like icy fingers grazing his skin. He spun around, but no one was there. "Get it together," he whispered, shaking his head. Click, the sound of a camera shutter, but not his. Alex froze. Slowly, he turned to see another camera sitting on a nearby gurney. It was old, the kind used decades ago, with a flashbulb that looked ready to explode. He hadn't seen it when he entered the room. "Okay, this is creepy," he said aloud, his voice cracking. He grabbed his equipment and decided it was time to leave. As he retraced his steps, he noticed something odd. The graffiti on the walls was different. The symbols were darker, fresher, and seemed to twist unnaturally as if they were alive. Then came the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the wind brushing against the walls, but soon they grew louder, clearer. Voices overlapped, speaking in hushed tones Alex couldn't understand. He broke into a jog, desperate to find the exit. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting and turning in ways they hadn't before. Every door he tried was locked. His breathing grew ragged, and the whispers turned into faint laughter. He stopped at a hallway that wasn't there when he entered. At the end of it stood a figure. A nurse in an old-fashioned uniform, her back to him. The fabric of her dress was stained, and her cap tilted awkwardly. "Excuse me?" Alex called, though his voice was barely a whisper. The nurse didn't move. Alex took a step forward, and the lights flickered violently. When they steadied, the nurse was closer, though she hadn't moved. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if trying to listen to something only she could hear. Alex's legs refused to move. The nurse suddenly twitched, her body jerking in small, erratic movements. She turned her head slowly, revealing a face obscured by shadows. Only her eyes were visible, empty black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. The flashlight slipped from Alex's trembling hand. The darkness swallowed him, and the whispers became screams. When he came to, he was lying on a gurney in the operating theater, his camera on the floor next to him. The nurse stood over him, her face now fully visible, a grotesque, contorted mask of rage and agony. She leaned in close, her breath cold and rancid. "You'll stay here," she hissed, like the others. Alex screamed as the shadows closed in, consuming him. Months later, a group of urban explorers ventured into Blanchard Memorial. In the ICU, they found a camera. Its memory card contained dozens of photos, all taken from Alex's perspective. The final image was a blurry shot of the nurse's face, her black void-like eyes staring directly into the lens. Alex was never found. The old St. Mary's Hospital had stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its walls covered in creeping vines. Everyone in the nearby town avoided it. The stories of what happened inside were enough to keep most people away. Patients disappearing, doctors who went mad, and the infamous Room 6, where screams were said to echo long after the last patient left. Megan didn't care about the rumors. As a freelance journalist, she had been assigned to write a piece on the hospital's dark history, and a first-hand look would make her story stand out. She arrived just before dusk, armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. The front entrance was chained shut, but a broken window near the side of the building offered an easy way in. She climbed through, careful not to cut herself on the jagged glass. Inside, the air was thick and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang. The lobby was a wreck. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and graffiti covered the once pristine walls. Megan began snapping photos, her footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. As she moved deeper into the hospital, the temperature seemed to drop. She passed long-abandoned exam rooms, their equipment rusted and broken. The deeper she went, the more the atmosphere changed. The silence was no longer just empty. It felt oppressive, as if the building itself was watching her. She found herself in the east wing, where the psychiatric ward had been. A faint sound stopped her in her tracks. It was a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming on glass. She followed it down the hallway, her flashlight beam trembling as she shone it ahead. The tapping led her to a door marked Room 6. The paint on the number had long faded, but it was still legible. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stared at the door. The tapping stopped. For a moment, the silence was suffocating. Then, a faint voice drifted from behind the door. "Help me." Megan's blood ran cold. The voice was weak and cracked, but it was unmistakably human. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. She hesitated, but then decided to open the door. The hinges creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a small, dark room. Her flashlight illuminated an old hospital bed in the center, its sheets stained and yellowed. "Is anyone there?" she asked, stepping inside. The room was empty. Her flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm. When the beam steadied, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Handprints on the walls, faint and smeared, as if someone had clawed at the paint. Then the door slammed shut behind her. Megan screamed and spun around, but the handle wouldn't budge. Her flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. She fumbled for her phone, using its weak light to illuminate the room. That's when she saw them. Figures stood in the corners of the room, their outlines barely visible in the dim light. They were unnaturally tall, their limbs elongated and twisted. Their heads hung at odd angles, and those eyes glowed faintly like embers in the dark. One of them moved, its neck cracking loudly as it turned to face her. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves rustling. Megan backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. She pressed against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. The figures moved closer, their limbs jerking unnaturally with every step. The air grew colder, and Megan felt something brush against her arm, cold and clammy, like the hand of a corpse. She shut her eyes, praying this was all some horrible nightmare. When she opened them again, the room was empty. The door was ajar, swinging gently, as if nothing had happened. Megan bolted, not daring to look back. She ran through the hallways, her breath hitching with every shadow that seemed to shift in the corners of her vision. When she finally burst outside, the cold night air hit her like a slap. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. Back at her apartment, she reviewed the photos on her camera, hoping to find some explanation for what she had experienced. Most of the images were as she remembered, empty halls and abandoned rooms. But as she flipped through them, she stopped on a photo she didn't remember taking. It was of room 6. The bed was still there, but now a figure stood next to it, one of the tall, twisted beings she had seen, and its glowing eyes stared directly into the lens. Megan quit her job the next day. She never wrote the article, but the locals say she was never quite the same after that night. No one knows for sure what she saw, but the hospital remains abandoned, its dark secrets waiting for the next unlucky soul to wander in.